Okay, so first I'm going to talk about what you would otherwise be receiving essentially in the tutorials if you had them this week. So as was explained to you last week, the assessment is all about creating a WordPress site for the purposes of creating your online portfolio, which you will hopefully keep and maintain beyond this unit. The technical requirements for that is that we need you to have your own web hosting and domain name. Okay, and while we're aware that there is QUT web hosting, okay, there's lots of good reasons not to use it for this. And so there are reasons that we are making a requirement that you get your own external domain. So first of all, if you're thinking forward to after this unit and after you've left university, you're going to want to show clients, prospective employers, your portfolio. If it's sitting on the QUT web server, then the only way that someone's going to be able to see it is if they themselves have a QUT logon. So unless you plan to work only for QUT for the rest of your life, then that's probably not a good idea. Okay, and so, I mean, you might say, okay, well, I'll do it on the QT server now and I'll migrate it later, okay? But that's a step. Migrating a website is not fun, so you may as well put it in one place now. Also, using, I don't know how much you've used the QT web server space before, but using it can be a hassle, okay? It's fairly locked down. You don't have access to configure the web server, so you can't do things like, upgrade your versions of PHP or do a lot of more complicated things with databases and so forth. So getting those things changed requires going through QT tech support, and often they'll just say, no, we're not going to do it. And probably the major thing, which is what we've kind of discovered was the main reason why we just completely want to avoid the QT web server is unless they've updated it, which they haven't for the last few years, so I wouldn't be surprised if they still haven't. The versions of PHP and MySQL that they have on the QT web server are not recent enough to actually run the most recent version of WordPress. So if you were to use it, you'd have to install an old version of WordPress, and then there'd be lots of things that were different to the way I'd be demonstrating. Okay, and if I haven't convinced you enough already that it's not a good idea, then try it and then you'll probably believe me. Okay, so hopefully that's convinced you for the need for your own web space. And ultimately, I mean, if you're going to exist in this field, you're going to need some sort of presence online beyond, your Facebook account or your Twitter account. Somewhere where you can actually put up your work and any other sort of stuff that you want to contribute to the internet. If you look at a lot of people giving advice on what they actually like to see in a portfolio, a lot of them actually say we like to see that you've got a blog as well, where you're actually contributing to the discussion of the space around whichever area you want to focus on, design or development or whatever it might happen to be. So some sort of active engagement in the space there. And so I think that draws into, this is one of the reasons why we try and get you to, sort of document and blog about your work and your progress, because it's a skill that, aside from the work itself, that is a really good way to demonstrate your process around the whole idea of designing and working in a team and all sorts of things. Okay, so it's another good reason to have a public presence on the internet in your own web server space. Okay, so enough about the why. Let's talk about the how. So, has anyone got their own web hosting already? Yeah, a couple of people. That's cool. So, if you've got it already, feel free to use that for this assignment. Most of you don't know, so I'm just going to briefly go through how you go about obtaining that and setting it up. And it can seem daunting at first, but trust me, it's not really. So essentially there's two components to this. You need web hosting. Okay, so web hosting is essentially a computer sitting somewhere that's always connected to the internet, where your files that make up your website sit and are served to anyone who wants to access them. You can turn any computer you want that's connected to the internet into a web server. You can do it to your own computer, but for people to be able to access, you'd have to make sure it's online 24/7. So generally what we do is we have companies called web hosts who basically have rooms full of computers set up that are running web servers, and you basically rent a bit of space on one of those computers for your website, which will then always be online and connected to the internet. Okay, and the second thing that you need is a domain name. So the way that we address computers on a network is through an IP address, and you could actually punch in the IP address of any website and access it that way. But because a number like 741253910 is a lot harder to remember than google.com, okay, we have these things called domain names. So a domain name is something like google.com or qt.edu.au, whatever it is. Okay, and that points to a specific domain name so people can more easily remember how to get to your website. So they're the two things that we need. Now, the next question that inevitably gets asked is, I've done a search for web hosting and there's thousands of them. Which one do I use? And it's really not a question that I can give a simple answer for. Use this one. Because it changes all the time. My only advice is kind of do your research, ask around if other people have used ones that have had good experience with. In some ways, it's like a lot of things. You tend to get what you pay for. Usually the difference in price tends to come down to things like how much hard drive space you get on the server, how much monthly bandwidth that will let you transfer to and from your site, and then things like, whether you actually get to talk to a human when you have technical support questions or not. But other than that, they're kind of, in some sense, they're also much of a muchness. So I provided a few links here. The top link is just, I just did a quick bit of Googling around, and there's a bunch of these here that I've never heard of, but you'll find sites that do reviews on them. Try and look up ones that are recent, not from 2001, because things can change quite a lot. So do a search thumb, look at reviews. I guess the only other thing you really need to decide on is whether you want to use a Australian web hosting provider or a overseas one. Often it's tempting to use a one from the US because it can be a little bit cheaper, especially when the Australian dollar is better. But there are some drawbacks to that, namely, while it may appear cheaper, if you've ever done any sort of currency exchange, you'll know that you never get the actual exchange rate, so it might not be as cheap as it seems. And then you'll probably have to deal with the fluctuation in currency as well. So given that the Australian dollar is on the slide, an American hosting company might be cheaper now, but it might become more expensive later. So they're the sorts of things you need to weigh up. You also need to, think about, is it easier to get support from a local company or things like that. That's not to dissuade anyone from going with a non-Australian company if you want. If you find one, that's totally fine. I have listed some Australian hosting companies here. It's not to endorse any particular one over the other, but these are some of the ones that I'm at least familiar with. So other than that, yeah, as I say here, just kind of do your research. And if you have questions, then email the hosting company and ask them the question, and how quickly they get back to you might be a good indicator of how good their service is. It might be a good way of testing that. Okay, so now once you've decided on a web host, generally a web host will offer you a bunch of different packages. Okay, so here's an example of a screenshot of one of these Australian web hosting companies called Quadra. Okay, and you can see that they offer 5 different services. Okay, and they range from let's see, what's this? $50 a year to $200 a year. Okay, so it's quite a big price range. But you will generally find for what you need for the requirements of this class, and probably for most requirements, unless you intend to, start something like your own YouTube or Facebook or something, one of the lower tier things is probably going to be more than sufficient for you. I would suggest that if you're paying more than about $10 a month for hosting, then that's probably more than you need to be paying for the purposes of this. Now, in terms of technical requirements, there's only two technical requirements of your web hosting in order to host a WordPress site. So first of all, you need PHP to be on the web server, and it needs to be version 5.2.4 or greater. MySQL version 5.0 or greater. Okay, now most of these, from when I've looked at the sites, most of them don't list the versions very very obviously. You might be able to find if you dig into it a bit, but that's something that you could email them and they could tell you about. Having said that, I'll be very surprised if any of these companies weren't at least this up to date. That's not like PHP's up to version 5.6 now. So if they don't at least have those versions, then they're probably not a company that you want to go with anyway. Okay, and these are features that should be included with most basic plans. Okay, usually when you look at the plans on these websites, it will list what they support. Again, if I go back to this one, this is a good example because this is the only one of these that actually has a plan which doesn't support some of these things. So you'll notice on Quadra, their most basic setup here, it actually doesn't have PHP. And it doesn't have MySQL, okay? But the next tier up, the second cheapest one, does have PHP, and it does have, allows you to have 10 MySQL databases. Okay, so only the second cheapest one here already has all the requirements that you would need for it, okay? And if we look over here, even the cheapest version, I think here, allows you to have all of these same things as well. Okay, but as I said, if you're confused, send them an email and you can say something. They're used to dealing with people who are much less technically savvy than you. Okay, so if you email them and go, I need web hosting that can run database, what does this package allow? Okay, you can ask them a question like that and they should be able to tell you quite clearly. Oops. Okay, so that's web hosting. Now, in terms of hosting, there's a couple of things that I've put here that are expressly to avoid these things, because every time we've done this unit, usually, no matter how much I say it, one or two people ends up getting something like one of these, and it's not suitable for this unit. So you can go to WordPress.com and get a free WordPress site that kind of works like Tumblr or Blogger, okay? And it might seem intuitive that that would work for a unit where we're developing WordPress themes, okay? But that, I can't stress enough, that will not work for this unit. The reason is that, yes, you get a WordPress site, okay, but you can't actually, on the free version at least, and I don't know about the premium version, but in the free version, a lot of people attempt to do this because it doesn't cost any money. You can't actually customize the theme, okay? And the whole second assignment is about customizing a WordPress theme. So you can't do that on a free WordPress.com site. Also, any web hosting that has its own proprietary software for building the website, things like Squarespace or Wix or any of those other, site builder type hosting things, okay, they also won't work for this unit because they won't allow you to install WordPress and to create a custom WordPress theme. Okay. All right, so now you've found a web hosting company, you've started on a package, you've purchased that package. Okay, generally you can usually either pay monthly or yearly or 2 yearly, and the longer you pay for, you get a little bit of a discount. Okay, but either way, once you signed up, you should get an email, okay, and it will give you a bunch of information that you can use to log in to various different interfaces to administer your web hosting. Okay, so they'll give you things like a temporary, they might give you a temporary domain where you can access it, which is usually a subdomain of the host company site if your domain name is not yet pointing to your web hosting. They'll usually give you access to something like a control panel. Usually it's something called cPanel, and it's an interface. I've got a picture here. It looks like this, and it's basically a visual interface for administering things, so creating databases, adding, deleting things from the server, okay? They'll also, let's see down here, they'll also give you an FTP account, okay? An FTP account, that's the way you actually transfer files from your computer to the web server, okay? It's basically like a file explorer, but you need to log in with a domain, a username and a password, and then that will allow you to transfer files to and from the server in your computer. And then they've also listed a support email address here. Okay, and usually these things usually have a lot of good, straightforward, often video type tutorials of how you do different things. Because as I said, they've set their service to deal with basically people with no technical savvy at all. So there should be plenty enough information for smart people like yourselves to figure that out. But as I said, if you have trouble, they always have support emails. You can ask them what you might think is a stupid question, and they'll have heard it 1,000 times, so that's fine. Okay, so that's web hosting. Second part, domain name registration, is quite a bit simpler. All you're doing here is you're basically buying rights to the sole use of a domain name for a certain amount of time. Usually you buy it for a year, okay, and it's usually cheaper than, well, it should absolutely be cheaper than your web hosting, whereas web hosting for this is probably going to cost you no more than $10 a month, maybe even less, maybe $5 a month. Okay, domain name shouldn't really be costing you any more than about $10 or $20 a year. Okay, and you have to make sure though that you renew it every year. If you let your domain lapse, okay, someone else can come and grab it, and then you don't have that domain anymore. So there are domain name registrars as well, just like there are web hosting companies. Now, the simplest way to do this is all of the web hosting companies, when you sign up for web hosting, they will give you the option to also register a domain with them. The benefit of that is that it will already be set up to point to your web hosting, so you don't need to go through any further steps in order to point your domain name to your web host. Having said that, if you want, for price reasons or whatever other reasons, maybe you already have a domain but you don't have hosting, or you already have hosting but you want to go to a different hosting company and keep your existing domain, whatever reason, you can have your hosting and domain provided by different companies. Okay, so, and I've put, again, some links to places that discuss different domain name registrars, but really the service they offer is so simple, there's really no difference in any of them other than price. Now, there is something to note that depending on the type of domain that you get, the price will vary. .com and .com.au domains are usually more expensive than things like .net, .org, or other ones of those. So that's something to weigh up as well, whether you want the, the prestige of having a .com domain, or you're happy with a .net domain, which will cost you a third or a quarter of the price. Okay, so if you do have your domain name from a different company as your web server, then it's a reasonably simple process to point your domain name to the web server. Generally, what your web hosting will have is a thing called a domain name server. And basically what you do is you log into your web hosting and you get that domain name server. It's usually a URL, something like ns1.thehostingcompany.com or whatever, okay? But you just look for the domain name server, and then you log into your domain name registrar account, and then you put the web hosting's domain name server in there. Okay, now in my experience, pretty much everyone just does the domain and the web hosting from the same company to avoid this step, okay, which is probably a sensible option. But I do have a link here to detailed instructions if you do have it separately. And again, if you need help with it, email either or of the domain name registrar company or the web hosting, and they will help you transfer it over. Okay. So once you've got that, this is a screenshot of something of cPanel, which is a web interface that is very, very common for web hosting packages. You might have something different, okay, but it'll be something similar to this that allows you to administer your website. And we'll go over that sort of thing a little bit more, I think, in tutorials. But yeah, it essentially allows you to interface with that remote computer and do things that you would normally do on your own computer, add, delete files, configure settings, and all that sort of thing. Okay, and this is something which on the QUT server, you don't have access to anything like this. PHPMyAdmin is another common thing, allows you to configure databases. Okay, again, we can go over that in examples, but if you look again if you look at the cPanel, for example, okay, you'll notice up the top here that there's lots of wizards and video tutorials and stuff like that. So inbuilt with this stuff is a lot of help stuff on how to do different things. So rather than me duplicating that sort of thing, I recommend just looking there. And you'll see us using these sort of things as we demonstrate examples as well. Okay, so that's there. I wanted to deliver that first because it would be really good if you could sort that out this week, because next week is the first tutorial and we're going to start looking at PHP. And if you want to be able to follow along and do the examples on your own server, okay, it would be good for you to have your web hosting and domain name sorted out by then. Okay. All right, now, so on to part two. Yes.
If they've already got their own hosting, you'll show them how to do stuff.
Yep. Yeah, if you've already got your own hosting and you just want to set up a new site on a subdomain, I imagine if you've got your own hosting, you're already pretty savvy with configuring stuff like that, but it can help you set up subdomains or point a new domain to a different folder on your web server. So you can actually you can actually put multiple websites on one web hosting thing, okay? They generally just live in different folders, okay? And you point different domains to different folders on that web host. So it's not like if you want to run 5 different websites, you have to buy 5 different hosting packages. Are there any other questions about that process before I go on? Yeah.
In regards to actually choosing a domain,
preferably yes, but if you don't have it, I suppose you can still, as long as you purchase the web hosting, you can still access it with either the IP address or the temporary domain that they give you, and you can still log in and transfer files and stuff. So, I mean, choosing the domain name is the hard part, really, to be honest. I think every single word in the English language has already been registered as a domain. So it's kind of like, I guess, choosing a personalized number plate. You just got to keep trying ones until you find one that's not already taken. And
don't use DXB for
yeah,
that means nothing to anyone else.
Yeah, remember that this is going to be a sort of a long-lived thing. So think of it as, think of a domain name which represents you as a professional in your field of choice. Any other questions? Yeah. It doesn't have to be a name at all. In fact, if you've got anything but a quite uncommon name, I dare say it's already been taken as well. I know every variation of my name has. Yeah, so yeah, if you've got a brand or you intend to start a company, business, sole trader, you want to operate under a business name, you can do that, okay? And you can change your mind later. You can let the domain name expire after a year and buy a new domain name and point it to it, okay? So
yeah, you can change your domain name, but it's not good practice. And also we want this to be meaningful to you. So as long as, you know, what you do is a folio, if it's under a brand or a business name, that's fine. As long as it's gonna fulfill the criteria. You know, as long as we can market it. So thinking about that is a pretty important thing throughout the semester. But to get cracking and get started, as long as you've got posting next week, so you and probably good to have. But it's not, you're not stuck with it for life.
Yeah. So hosting's a number one priority. Domain name's the second priority. Any other questions? No? Okay, cool.